Okay, in this lesson, we're building out a joke API, so that allows us to connect to the Chuck Norris API and get jokes back from the Chuck Norris API. And there is a warning for this lesson that some of these jokes, they might be not your style, so you are welcome to skip this. Some of the jokes, they might be offensive, so keep that in mind that we're not writing the jokes. We're just connecting to the endpoint, the API, and getting some of the content back in order to practice constructing web applications. So this is an open, free JSON API that we can connect to, and they've got some documentation on the websites as well. So at the end, we are going to create an application that's going to generate a number of categories. When you click the category, it allows us to get a random joke from that category and display it on the page. I've made the jokes text fairly small, again, because we don't want to focus too much on the text of the joke, but more on the JSON data and creating the application. We can also search for a search term, and that will return back the joke according to whatever the search term is. So we do have the usage where we can just get a random joke. We're going to be also covering how we can generate and get the categories list. So this is just an array of all the different categories that are available for the jokes. And then from the categories, we can select a random joke. So building out the categories list dynamically of buttons, and then selecting from those buttons and generating a random joke from those categories, and also being able to search to return back joke results. And then outputting the content onto our page and making a fully interactive web application that's going to be driven from JSON data within the Chuck Norris API. This lesson, we're going to be connecting to the joke API, the Chuck Norris joke API. So the HTML file is set up the same way as in the earlier lessons. We've got the HTML elements that we can interact with, the button, also update and get an input value, and with the H1 have a title, and then linking to a new JS file. So that's app7.js. And in this case, we've just got the basics as well, starting out with connecting to the elements on the page, connecting them to objects that we can use in JavaScript, and then adding an event listener to the object. So when I click the button, we've got ready coming up, and we're ready to start interacting and getting some content from the endpoint API. So this is the api.chucknorris.io, so it's a free JSON API, and allows you to send Chuck Norris jokes. So this is a free API that you can interact with. You can also do a free text search by sending to Chuck and then question mark with the search term. So we'll try out a few of these different ways of making connections. As well, we can get jokes from particular categories. So they've broken it apart within categories. So this is also a JSON list that we can use as well. So let's make an interactive application using this Chuck Norris joke endpoint. So the first thing that we want to do is update and add the URL that we're connecting to. So the base URL for the Chuck Norris jokes is going to be this, so jokes random. And if we do want to have the search query, then we'd have to remove out the random so that we could accommodate for search, for random, for categories. So let's just have the base URL, and then when you click the button, and this will output the joke. And actually, let's do the get joke. So that's the URL that we're going to make the fetch request to. So fetch request to the URL and return back the response object, and then take the response object and return it as JSON, and then get the JSON data, and then we're going to output that onto the console. So that's going to be the data. So the URL that we want to connect to, so this is just going to be jokes random. So outputting and using the get joke, and let's update and create a temp URL, and the URL is going to use the base URL, and then add to it just the text of random. So that will return back a random joke. And let's use this as the URL that we're connecting to. And also let's just update this to 1. So they're not passing in and we're not any confusion with the URL variable. So refresh, click the button, and just double check the code, click the button, and that should return back a joke. So we've got the basic, so we've got the categories, and we've got a value that's being returned. So the actual joke is sitting within the value. So there's our joke, and whenever we click it, we can output a different joke. So let's add the joke to page. And we'll take output, clean out the inner HTML, and add the joke to the page. So we'll just add and append whatever we've currently got on the page with whatever we've got for the value. And instead of doing console log, we're going to just output it to the page. So this gives us an opportunity to click and update and get different jokes. Let's also try the search of the jokes. So instead of the random one, we'll do a search query, and then we'll also get all of the categories, list them out, and have those as clickable buttons that we can get jokes from within those categories when we're making the API request. So let's update this to be the search query. So this button is going to take the value from the search, and let's update the parameters, so jokes, and update that to include search, and then whatever the query value is. So let's get the value, the query value, and we can get this from input val, so whatever the current value is. And that's going to be our query value. So add that as val1. And also we want to make sure that we don't have a val, an empty value. So let's add in test as a default value for val. Because currently within the input we don't have any contents there. So let's refresh. And for now we'll console log out the temp URL. And then we can open it up within the browser just to make sure it's working. So that is returning back some results. And the reason we're not getting the joke being added is that this is returning back an array of content. So we've got a number of results that are being returned back. So we can't send it over to get joke, where we have to get jokes for this case. So this is going to be in case we've got multiple items that are being returned. So we'll do the similar type format where we've got the fetch request, and except we're going to console log out the results as data so that we can take a closer look at the object that's being returned. And this should actually be going to get jokes. So let's save, and we're getting a total of 156 results. Let's try this result. So 131 results. So the input field is returning back different set of results. So the array here is contained within result. So let's update output and set the inner HTML, as we're going to be clearing out the output. And we want to get whatever was searched for, the total results. So let's add in the search term. And that's going to be equal to the val1. So do the search term. And we can output search term here, found, and then the number that we've found. And this is just coming from the JSON data under total. So data dot total will return back the total number of results that were found. So test found results. Let's try red. Found 617 results. So it is changing, and we are able to update it. Let's try another one. And big. So that finds 131 results. So all of the content is contained within the results. And this is where we can loop through and we can add the jokes. So taking data, results, and using for each, we're going to loop through each one of the results. So each one of these jokes. And how about we output the joke into the console. And just make sure you got the brackets around joke, as that's what's being returned. And that actually should be result, not results. So that's why it wasn't able to find the results. So we've got categories as an array, because it might contain multiple categories. It's got an icon, URL, an ID, URL, and a value. So the value is the one that we can use to output the joke. So if we want to add the joke to the page, we can select the joke and get the value. And then as we're looping through, that should add all of the jokes to the page. So let's try another one. Do something like happy. And that returned back the results. So you can style this and customize it as needed. The other option is that I want to loop through the array of categories and provide a way to select the contents of those categories and output those on the page. And I'm just going to add in a line break. So that will add in a line break so the jokes are separated. And next, let's loop through the categories. So as we load the page content, we did have an option for categories. So these are all the different categories that we can search under. So once the page loads, we can make a fetch request and build cats and just run the function to build the categories. And we're going to make a fetch request for the building of the categories. So let's set up the function and build cats. So to build all of the categories on the page. So we want to select the categories and add buttons to the page according to the categories. So using the jokes as the base URL, we're going to make a fetch request to get the categories. So let's first start by creating our URL temp, and we're going to use the URL 1 as the base, and then just append it with the categories. And this will return back the categories, and you can console log out the URL so that we can be sure that what URL we're working with. Let's load the page, build the categories, click the link to make sure that you're getting the categories. And this is presented within an array format. So that means that the returned results we can iterate through and we can output onto the page. So let's make our fetch request to the URL. So making our fetch request to the URL temp value and returning back our response object. And from that response object, this is JSON formatted, so we're able to return it back as JSON. And then lastly, let's do the last promise where we're getting the data results returned back, and we want to loop through the data. So let's do a console log and check out what we've got for data. So this should provide us a list of the categories, and from these categories we can then take data and use for each and loop through each one of the category and then use those and create some buttons on the page. And this actually needs to be button 1 or button temp. We're going to create some temporary buttons. So document, create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a button. And the button text, so button temp text content is going to be equal to whatever we've got for the cat value. And then we want to append these to the page. So let's take the button and we're going to append it to button. And append the button temp object to the button. Actually, we're going to append it to the H1. So first we'll clear the H1 and update the inner HTML. So that gives us a listing of all the buttons. And let's make the buttons clickable so that whenever we click the button, we can make the request to get the jokes. And we're not going to be doing the search term. This time we're going to be doing the category. As in the documentation, it provided us an option to get content by categories. So we've got the category and we can select a random joke from a category. So that's going to be the web URL that we want to use. So let's add in to the button temp, add an event listener to the button temp. So adding in the click event and then the event object. And this is where we can make the fetch request. And this is going to be the endpoint that we want to request to. And we're also got the category here. So under cat, so console log, and just make sure that we have the text object that's ready to use. So refresh. And that's getting the category as text. So we do need that in order to get the temporary URL. So for this temporary URL, we're going to use the URL and then concatenate to it random and then whatever the category value is. So add that in as a string, and then lastly add the category to it. And then now we can make a fetch request to the temp URL and then return back the response object. And the response can be responded back and returned back as JSON. And then once we have the content, so this is going to be the JSON content, we should have a value that's contained within there. And for now, we'll just console log out the JSON data. And that should be able to return back the value, and that will be the joke from the random joke in that category. So we've got a random joke within the category. When we click the categories, we can return back those jokes that are associated with those categories. And then also, just as we did before, we can add the joke content. And here, we just add the joke from the JSON value. And now whenever we click, we can get a joke from the particular category. Also, if we want, we can also clear out the inner HTML. So before we add joke, we can specify to the user which category it is that we're adding the joke from, and just specify the category. And also add to that a horizontal rule. So category, and then whatever joke that we've got for the category. So there we go, and we've completed the web application. Then you can apply styling to the elements as well. And cursor pointer, and this is just for the buttons. Let's make the font size bigger. Border, and you can apply whatever styling suits your design. This is just some quick styling for the buttons themselves. And I'm going to add that to each one of the button temps, using class list, and then add, and the class that I'm adding is the buttons. And actually, let's make this smaller. It's coming across fairly large. And a little bit less padding, so but we try 8 pixels. And I'll do a margin around them as well. So there's some space around the buttons. And it looks like we need just a touch more padding. And usually, because these are buttons, clickable buttons, I like to have the hover effect, and I usually typically will use the opacity so that whenever you hover over it, you get that kind of button feel to them. There's also ones like text transform, where you can capitalize the text. You can also change it to uppercase as well. And just click through it, make sure that it's working. And also for output, and I'll just set the margin here to auto and set a default width 70% and a border. So that will output the content, and also I'm going to add in a font size for the content. And you can also apply styling to the input and to the click me button. So the click me button is actually a search. So that's search. These ones are clickable categories. And I am going to apply some styling to the input as well as to the button object. And let's update the font size to 2EM. And check those to display as block. And actually I'm going to do this as inline block. So that will apply some spacing. And let's do a text align, and we can center align the text. And if we want to align this, to center align that, we'd have to have an element wrapping it, and that way we could align it. We could also set a width of the input 50%. And that's actually setting on the button as well. So just leave that, and we can set to the button. And that's the button class. And let's make the font size even bigger. So that gives us a better search option, where we can search for all the related text. We can select a joke at random from a category. And it's up to you to take it from here and update your application accordingly. This is a practice lesson to connect to an endpoint and get JSON data back and construct a dynamic web application that changes depending on the data that we're getting back from the endpoint.